Hello Biology 100 students. Today we're going to take a look at the urinary system. Now the urinary system is a very important body system that helps to filter our blood and take out waste products and also maintain salt and water balance. So the organs of the urinary system are as follows. We have over here the kidneys, and the kidneys are located basically under the diaphragm. They're not actually in the abdominal cavity themselves. They're actually behind the abdominal cavity under a membrane. So they're actually called retroperitoneal. Okay, draining from the kidneys, we have these structures over here, which are called ureters. So the job of the ureters is to drain the urine from the kidneys down into the urinary bladder. And the urinary bladder is a reservoir for urine. It stores urine until it's ready to be voided. And of course, the urethra is the small tube that drains that urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. All right, we said in the first slide that the function of the kidney was to regulate blood volume, blood pressure, things like that. Well, there's actually other functions as well. One is it helps to regulate our blood ions. Remember, ions or electrolytes, we're talking about something that has a charge. So mainly we're talking about salt ions like sodium, potassium, calcium. So it's helping to regulate the correct amounts of these ions in our blood and also in our other body fluids. It also helps to regulate pH. Remember that our blood pH is optimally somewhere around 7.35 to 7.45, so the kidneys are helping to maintain that ideal blood pH by getting rid of either excess hydrogen ions or hydroxide ions. The kidneys are very important in regulating blood volume. So we each have around 5 to 6 liters of blood, and that blood is composed mainly of water. And so regulating the water in the blood is a very important function of the kidneys. Think about when you go to the 7-Eleven and you get that 765-ounce mega gulp and you drink the whole thing down. What does that do to your blood volume? Well, theoretically, that would increase your blood volume and increase blood pressure, but it doesn't usually have that effect because the kidneys are able to get rid of the excess fluid. The other function of the kidneys is to maintain blood pressure. Now, blood pressure was the pressure of the blood within our blood vessels. And it has two components. One is how much volume is there, how much blood volume, but also how much contraction do we have in our blood vessels there. So the kidneys have various hormonal ways of maintaining blood volume, but also in stimulating vasoconstriction through the angiotensin-aldosterone system that we'll talk about later on. Also, the kidneys maintain blood osmolality. Osmolality, if you remember back, is just the ratio of solutes to water. And remember that your blood and your body fluids are not made of distilled water. They actually have some solutes or salts in there. So maintaining the ideal balance between these solids and the water is important. The kidney also produces hormones. The one that we'll talk about is erythropoietin. Remember, erythropoietin caused us to produce more red blood cells from our red bone marrow. And so erythropoietin is made by the kidneys. And finally, the kidney helps us to get rid of metabolic wastes such as urea, and urea is derived from protein metabolism, so we need to get rid of that, and the principal way we do that is through the urinary system. Okay, this is just another frontal section here showing a little bit more detail in anatomy we covered in the last slide. Again, we have the renal cortex, which is the outer layer right here of the kidney, and then we have the renal medulla, and the medulla is divided into these pyramids. And the cortex and the medulla is where blood is being filtered and where that filtrate is going through something called nephrons. And nephrons are the functional unit of the kidneys. Now, anything that is not reabsorbed back in the bloodstream is going to end up as urine. And so that urine ends up draining in what we call these minor calyces and then a major calyx into something called the renal pelvis. So the renal pelvis is a collecting area for the urine, which is eventually going to leave the kidney by something called the ureter. All right, this slide just shows that the kidney has lots of blood vessels. Now, in a human anatomy course, you would have to know all the names of these blood vessels and the circulation patterns, but for Biology 100, you don't have to know that. What you do have to know is there's a lot of blood vessels, and the reason there's a lot of blood vessels is the main job the kidney has is filtering the blood. At any one time, about 25% of your cardiac output is diverted directly to your kidneys. So your kidneys are getting an incredible blood flow, and they're filtering your entire blood volume in around 1 minute. Okay, so we said a couple slides ago that the nephron was the functional unit of the kidney, and that's true. So nephrons are basically divided into two regions. We have something called the renal corpuscle, and the renal corpuscle is where filtration occurs, and we'll talk about that process. The green area right here is the renal corpuscle. It consists of a glomerulus, which is a capillary bed, and that capillary bed is surrounded by a capsule called the Bowman's capsule. So this glomerulus is a very leaky capillary bed, and this is where filtration occurs. Now, the second part of our nephron is something called the renal tubule. It's everything outside the Bowman's capsule here. So any of this tube right here is renal tubule, and we're going to learn the parts in the next slide. Okay, here's an easier picture of a nephron there. So we're going to point out the two major parts. Firstly, we have the renal corpuscle. So the renal corpuscle consists of the glomerulus, which is a very leaky capillary bed, and it also consists of the Bowman's capsule. The Bowman's capsule is going to be collecting any fluid that leaks out of this glomerulus, which again is a very leaky capillary bed. Now everything else here that you see is part of a renal tubule. So the renal tubule has this part up here called a proximal convoluted tubule. Remember, proximal just means closer to, and convoluted just means squiggly or wavy. Next we have something called the loop of Henle, and the loop of Henle is this long loop which goes from the cortex, oftentimes down the medulla, and then it comes back up. And then we have something called the distal convoluted tubule, which is this part right here. And the distal convoluted tubule leads to something called the collecting duct. So there is our collecting duct. And the collecting duct is basically the exit point from the nephron, and anything that remains in the collecting duct by the time we get to the end is going to be part of the urine. That's very important to know. Anything that stays in that tubule and stays in the tubule until we get to the end of the collecting duct is going to become urine. Okay, now some facts about nephrons and nephron numbers. Remember, nephrons are the functional units of the kidneys. They're the little guys that actually do the work of filtration and reabsorption. So nephrons, you have about 1 million of them per kidney, and you don't make more during life. You're probably losing some, but you're not able to make any more. And so as you lose nephrons from your kidneys, some other nephrons can hypertrophy. They can grow larger and begin to take on a greater role to compensate for the lost nephrons, but it's not possible to replace the nephrons. So that's very important to know. All right, now we're going to take a look at nephron processes. And nephrons basically do 3 different things. They do filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So let's take a look at filtration first. Now, filtration is the pressure-driven movement of fluids from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. So let's take a look at our glomerulus right here. This is just a very leaky capillary bed. And because it's very leaky and we're applying pressure to it, stuff is going to be leaking out of that capillary bed into this receptacle, which is called the Bowman's capsule. Now, the glomerulus itself is leaky, but it's also surrounded by something called podocyte cells. And the podocyte cells form basically an interdigitating grid or meshwork that regulates what can move out of the capillary bed and what stays inside the capillary bed. So very small things like water molecules, salts, sugars, those can easily move out of this capillary bed and then into the Bowman's capsule. And the Bowman's capsule is eventually going to transmit these into the renal tubule. But what stays inside the capillary bed? Well, larger things like red blood cells and white blood cells and large proteins as well. So I like to think of the process of filtration as being akin to boiling some pasta on the stove. You've got your pasta in there and your water and your salt, right? And so that's kind of like blood. Blood is a connective tissue that has cells, aka the noodles here, but it also has a lot of fluid in there, the water, the electrolytes, etc. So the membrane around the glomerulus, that slit membrane, is sort of like a colander. It allows some things to go through into the Bowman's capsule, but not others. For example, here as we pour our pasta and water into this colander, what's going through? Well, it's the water, it's the salt, it's any spices you might have put in there prematurely. But what doesn't go through here are the noodles. The noodles are too big. And so the noodles here, again, are akin to proteins in red blood cells and white blood cells. So these are retained within the glomerulus, and eventually they leave that glomerulus through what we call the efferent arterioles. So they never enter the Bowman's capsule. What does enter the Bowman's capsule is water, solutes, and also some glucose, and maybe some very, very, very tiny proteins. All right, I said before that at any one time, about 25% of your cardiac output is diverted to your kidneys. And so the kidneys have this really high blood flow, and they're doing a lot of filtration. We have 1 million nephrons each. Each of those nephrons has a glomerulus, and those glomerulus are doing a crazy amount of filtration. So if we look at the amount of filtration that happens per day for males and females, you're going to be filtering around 150 liters a day of fluid or blood, and that equates to about 75 2-liter containers of soda, right? That's a lot of fluid. You don't have that much fluid in your body. On average, your body has around 5 to 6 liters of blood, so you're filtering your blood many, 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 many times. Okay, males, you tend to have larger body mass, and so you're filtering around 180 liters a day or 90 2-liter containers. So that's equivalent to what you see here. So amazing amounts of filtering going on the kidneys. It's just too cool. But remember, I said that anything that stays in that tubule till it gets to the end is going to be part of the urine. You don't urinate 180 liters a day, thank God. What you do urinate is probably around 1 to 2 liters a day, so a half to 1 whole 2-liter container. So that means that the majority of things that end up in the renal tubule have to be pulled out, and that process is called reabsorption. Okay, so the nephron has 3 different functions: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Filtration is the pressure-driven movement of fluids from inside the glomerulus, which was up here, into the Bowman's capsule. Remember, the glomerulus is a blood vessel, but it's a very leaky blood vessel, and it's under comparatively high pressure for a capillary. And so the pressure from the heart generates pressure on that capillary bed, and some of the stuff is going to leak out. Again, we're talking about things like water, electrolytes, but larger things like red blood cells and white blood cells stay behind. So filtration is the pressure-driven movement of fluids from our glomerulus into our Bowman's capsule. On the other hand, reabsorption moves in the opposite direction. Reabsorption is the movement of water and solutes from the renal tubule, which is right here, back into the bloodstream. As it turns out, there's a lot of things that we filter that end up in the filtrate that we really want to hang on to. Things like the water and glucose. These are things that we don't mean to throw out. You've heard the expression of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. If we didn't do reabsorption, that is what would happen. We'd be throwing away glucose and all the water that we need just if we went through filtration alone. So reabsorption helps us take back some of those things we want to conserve and hang on to, and we put those back into the bloodstream. The third process here is called secretion. Secretion works in the same direction as filtration, but the mechanism is different. So secretion is where we take things that are in the bloodstream and we put them back into the tubule again. Because again, anything that stays in that tubule is going to end up as urine. And think of this as things that, like, maybe somebody pushes towards you at the table and says, oh, have this liver and onions. And you might say, thank you, but no, and you're going to push it back. And so that's what's happening here with secretion. Things that are waste products like urea and stuff like that, that are inadvertently reabsorbed, are going to be pushed back across that capillary, or back across those capillaries, back into the renal tubule, so that they'll eventually be excreted with the urine. Okay, so we said reabsorption was the movement of things from the renal tubule back in the bloodstream, and it's usually things that we want to conserve and hang on to. So we can take a look at this table and see what gets reabsorbed and what doesn't. First of all, let's take a look at water. Water, we filter around 180 liters a day, and we reabsorb almost the same amount. So water is actually important. We don't want to lose all this water from our bloodstream, because then we would lose blood volume and blood pressure. So we only actually secrete or excrete around 1 to 2 liters of urine a day. Let's look at something else, glucose. So glucose down here, looks like we have about 160 some grams a day that we filter, and we reabsorb the same amount, 162 grams, and ideally we have no sugar in the urine. And that's a good thing, because why? Sugar is energy, right? We're using sugar to fuel our brains, we're using it to fuel our muscles and things like that. So we don't want to get rid of it, we want to hang on to it. But sugar is filtered, it makes it into the filtrate, so we need to pull it back out of the filtrate and stick it back in the bloodstream. But now let's look at something like urea. So urea is over here, we filter around 54 grams, okay, reabsorb 24, and we get rid of around, what does that say, 30 grams. So urea is a metabolic waste product that's derived from protein metabolism, and we want to get rid of that because having too much urea is toxic. So one of the big functions of the urinary system, in addition to conserving water, is actually getting rid of these metabolic waste products so they don't poison our body. Okay, now let's talk about how we regulate water balance and what happens to your body when you're dehydrated. So I want you to think about the last time you really exerted yourself, like you ran all out. Maybe you were a marathon runner, or maybe you were just out on the roof putting up jingles all day or something like that. But think of the last time you really outdid yourself and felt really, really dehydrated. What's going on in your body? Well, first of all, you're probably sweating a lot, right? And that's how you're losing a lot of that moisture, a lot of that body water. And so what is your body going to do to cope with that and maintain homeostasis? Well, fortunately, we have a hormonal regulation of hydration or tubular reabsorption through a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So think about what that name means. So diuretic is something that does what? Diuretics make you pee, right? Okay. So an antidiuretic is something that prevents you from peeing or reduces your amount of urination. So ADH is a hormone that's secreted when we are dehydrated, And the purpose of this hormone is to make sure we don't lose too much water because we're already dehydrated. We want to hang on to as much water as possible so we don't get further dehydrated. So ADH is secreted by our posterior pituitary. It's actually made in the hypothalamus. And the secretion stimulus here, the reason we secrete it is we are dehydrated. And the results of ADH secretion is that we hang on to water, we conserve water so we don't get further dehydrated. So let's take a look at how that feedback loop works now. Okay, so what you can see here is we have our pituitary gland up here, and then we have our hypothalamus above that, and then over to this side we have our nephron, and you can see that nephron has water moving through it, and that water is entering our collecting duct. Now remember that any of the water that is still in the collecting duct by the time I get to the end is going to be pee. It's going to end up in the urine. So the question is, what's going to happen to this water? You're already dehydrated. I said you were sweating, you haven't had any water to drink all day long, so how are we going to conserve this water? Well, let's take a look at the process. So step one here is that the hypothalamus detects the fact that you're dehydrated. The hypothalamus, remember, was above the pituitary gland, and it has osmoreceptors in there that are monitoring the saltiness of the blood. So as you get dehydrated, you lose water, but you don't lose as much salt. And so the blood actually gets saltier. So as the blood gets saltier, the hypothalamus goes, you're getting dehydrated. We need to do something about it. So the next step will be, bam, the hypothalamus will send nerve impulses to the posterior pituitary. Remember, the posterior pituitary doesn't actually make any hormones, but it does store two hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. And those are antidiuretic hormone and also the hormone oxytocin. So the next step here will be that once we've stimulated the posterior pituitary, it's going to secrete ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Remember, hormones hitch a ride on the bloodstream in order to get to their target organs. And the target organ for ADH here is the kidneys. So once that ADH travels to the kidney, it is going to alter the permeability of our collecting duct. It's going to insert something called aquaporins. And aquaporins are little, essentially, water doors that are going to allow movement of fluids or water from our collecting duct back into the capillaries that are surrounding it. So it's going to allow it to move back into the bloodstream. So that's exactly what it does. The aquaporins then divert that water that was destined initially for the urinary bladder. They divert that water back out of the collecting duct and back into the bloodstream. So in this way, they help to facilitate increased amounts of reabsorption and do more water conservation. As a result, the amount of urine that we produce when we have high ADH secretion is going to be really, really low. So you've probably noticed before that your urine color changes throughout the day, and definitely depending on whether you're hydrated or dehydrated. So normally in a good urination, if you're well hydrated, your urine's going to be kind of straw colored in here. And the coloration is caused by the solutes. And the solids here are urea, sodium, things like that. But let's take a look at what your urine might look like when you're really dehydrated. So over here you can see the really dark urine here, and that it contains, it looks a lot darker, but the reason that it's darker is not because it contains more waste products, but because it contains less water, right? When you are dehydrated, your body is still trying to get rid of all the waste products, the urea, etc., but it's trying to do that in a smaller volume of water. As a result, it has a higher specific gravity and it looks a lot darker. So the fact that you have dark urine is not bad, just indicates you might want to drink a little water. But the fact that your kidney is able to produce urine like this means the kidneys are working in optimal condition. And some people with kidney damage, they can't produce a concentrated urine, and that's very problematic. Okay, this slide just shows what happens when you drink too much water, and that's called water intoxication. Now, when I say drinking too much water, I don't mean that you drank an extra liter or something. These people were drinking way too much water. In case one over here is a scientific paper describing water intoxication in some recruits under basic training. And so these guys were out there exerting themselves in the hot sun, doing lots of exercise, and so they were sort of prophylactically drinking lots of water. And they were drinking, if you take a look here, it translates somewhere between 2 to 5 gallons of water. Now that is a lot of water. It's a ridiculous amount of water. When we do that, we dilute our body water, and if the kidneys can't keep up in maintaining that salt-water balance, you can actually have hyponatremia, which is lower than normal sodium, and that can be fatal. And so we have had a few military recruits die that way. Fortunately, a lot of them do survive, but it's important that they don't drink way too much water. The other case here is somebody that was participating in a radio contest called Hold Your Wee for a Wee. And the purpose of the contest was to give the contestants large quantities of just distilled water. They would drink it, and whoever could drink like a gallon of water and hold their urine without urinating, whoever the last person was to urinate, got a free Wii entertainment console. So this woman here participated in the contest, drank, I think, over a gallon of water in a very short period of time, had a very small body mass index, and as a result, she became hyponatremic, low sodium, and she actually ended up dying as a result. And the radio station was sued, and it was a big to-do in the news. So suffice it to say, there is too much of a good thing. So only drink when you're thirsty or when you've overexerted yourself, and always be watching how much volume you're drinking. All right, in addition to having the ADH system for regulating body water and hydration, we have another hormonal system that helps us to regulate blood pressure and blood volume. And that's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And that's a very complex system. I'm not going to hold you to the specifics of it, but I do want you to understand in general how it works. So first of all, we have renin. Renin is an enzyme that's secreted by the kidneys. And the stimulus for renin release is lower than normal blood pressure. So let's say you've lost blood volume, either you've been sweating too much, or you've actually had an injury, or for whatever reason your blood pressure drops. The kidneys will detect that. They'll secrete the enzyme renin. Now renin will act on an inactive hormone called angiotensinogen and convert it into angiotensin 1. Now angiotensin 1 is still not the active hormone. That gets converted by something called angiotensin converting enzyme, which is in your lungs and other tissues, into something called angiotensin 2. Now, the ACE enzyme here is important because what we're finding now is that tissues in the body that are receptive to the angiotensin converting enzyme are also tissues that get infected with a COVID-19 virus. So that's a very interesting way in which the virus enters the cells, is through these receptors. Anyway, so here we had angiotensin 2, right? Angiotensin 2 will act on the renal cortex, and the renal cortex will secrete something called aldosterone. And aldosterone does a couple things. Aldosterone acts on the renal tubule, and it causes that tubule to reabsorb more sodium from the tubule and put it back in the bloodstream. And so remember here that sodium is a solute. And what do solids do? So the sodium is going to suck the water with it and pull that water back in the bloodstream. As a result, we are going to have an increased reabsorption of water, increased reabsorption of sodium. That's going to build up our blood volume, which should increase blood pressure. And finally, angiotensin also has an effect on the blood vessels themselves. Think about what the word here, angiotensin, means. Angio refers to vessels, and tensin means to tense. And so angiotensin can actually cause constriction of the blood vessels, which helps to raise the blood pressure. So big picture here is that the kidneys secrete renin when blood pressure is low, and renin inadvertently helps us to reabsorb more sodium and then more water, and it also is going to cause eventually blood vessel constriction. All of these things are going to help to raise the blood pressure back up into normal levels. Okay, now we get to the fun stuff. We're going to talk about diuretics. So diuretics are things that do what? They make you pee. So think about the things that you have in your house you might eat or drink that make you pee. Well, probably if you drink coffee, coffee definitely makes you urinate, right? Now, coffee stimulates urination because it retards the reabsorption of sodium molecules from inside the tubule back in the bloodstream. And remember, sodium is a solute, and solutes suck. So if this solute stays inside the renal tubule, it's going to suck water down towards it. So that water is going to leave. You're going to urinate more after drinking 1 or 2 cups of coffee. The other thing that I hope not a lot of you have sampled yet is alcohol, right? Alcohol is a classic diuretic. If you see people at like fraternity parties or just house parties and stuff like that, after an hour or so of drinking, people are just lined up at the bathroom being like, oh God, I have to pee again. And the reason is that alcohol has an inhibitory effect on the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. It prevents us from secreting a lot of ADH, and without that ADH, we're not able to reclaim that water that we normally would reclaim through our aquaporins. So as a result, all that water stays in the renal tubule and ends up being excreted in the urine. And that's why people that drink have to pee a lot more than people that don't. Finally, we do use diuretics also in the medical field. This is something called furosemide, which is a loop diuretic. It acts on the loop of Henle, and we can use diuretics, among other things, to treat things like hypertension. Remember, hypertension was greater than normal blood pressure, and so one way to combat blood pressure is to reduce blood volume or reduce fluid volume. And one way to do that is to give somebody a diuretic that causes them to pee out more of their blood volume, just the water part, and that reduces blood pressure. Okay, now we need to talk about something pretty serious, especially for here in Hawaii where we have lots of kidney disease. So kidney disease happens when the kidney is no longer able to efficiently filter blood and get rid of waste products. And so we classify kidney disease based on the filtration rate. In a normal person with 2 functional kidneys, they're going to be filtering about 120 milliliters of fluid every minute. So that's optimal. It varies with ethnicity and age, etc. But as somebody goes down in GFR, or glomerular filtration rate, we start to worry about kidney disease. Once they get below 60 mils per minute, we say that they have kidney disease or chronic kidney disease, because for most people, this is something that happens over time. Now, we'll watch that person for a long time. We'll probably send them to a nephrologist. A nephrologist is somebody that studies the functional units of the kidneys. And if their GFR falls below 20 or 15, then we say that they are in kidney failure. At this point, the kidneys are no longer able to filter the blood and remove the metabolic waste products. And so as a result, we have a buildup of these byproducts in the blood, and this is called uremia and azotemia. And basically, this just means that we have a buildup of urea and other nitrogenous waste in the blood, and it can cause a lot of problems for this person. The other thing that kidney failure can cause is anemia. Now, anemia is lack of red blood cells or lack of oxygen binding of those cells. Remember that one of the functions of the kidney was to secrete erythropoietin, and erythropoietin helped us to produce more red blood cells from our red bone marrow. Well, if you have a kidney that looks like that, how functional do you think that is? If the kidney tissue is damaged, the hormone-producing tissue is also damaged. So they stop producing as much EPO, or erythropoietin, and as a result, they become anemic. So the causes of kidney disease are various, but the 2 major causes are right here, are diabetes mellitus and also hypertension. So remember, diabetes mellitus was an endocrine disorder where we had blood sugar levels going way too high, and that could be type 1 or type 2. And as a result of having really high blood sugar levels for a long period of time, the kidney tissue, which is delicate, is very easily damaged. So diabetes is definitely the #1 cause of renal failure, particularly here in Hawaii. The second most common cause is something called hypertension. Hypertension just means you have greater than normal blood pressure. Again, both of these are conditions that cause kidney damage over time. They're not acute, they're chronic. There's plenty of diabetics out there that have perfectly functioning kidneys. But if you're not managing your diabetes correctly, the increased levels of glucose can cause problems, as can long-term hypertension. So obviously we want to try to minimize the effects of these 2 diseases before they have effects on our kidney function. So what are the options once you have somebody in kidney failure? Well, you've probably heard of dialysis, or in this case, hemodialysis. So hemodialysis is basically we're having a machine do for your body what your kidneys used to do. We're basically taking blood out of the body through a catheter, and then we're running it through a machine that has this sort of semi-permeable tube in it. And your blood is going through this semi-permeable tube, and the tube itself is in a container of a dialysate solution, which is a hypoosmotic solution. It helps to pull out the things like the urea, the metabolic waste products, but the pores in that membrane are too small to allow the blood cells and the proteins to cross. So eventually the waste material goes into one container, and then your blood gets circulated back into your body via another catheter. So this setup actually works fairly well. People that have kidney failure tend to get dialysis sometimes 1 to 2 to 3 or more times a week, depending on how bad their kidney damage is. Now we're going to look briefly at some other disorders of the renal system, and one of these is called uroliths, or kidney stones. So these are basically accretions of material like calcium carbonate, or it could also be proteins or uric acid, things like that, that form in various parts of the kidneys. They can form up here in the minor calyces, which help to collect the urine. They can form down here in our renal pelvis. They can form in the ureter or get lodged in the ureter, and they're very painful. They manifest themselves first as back pain. So a lot of people will go to their doctor and say, oh, I've got a pain in the back and I think I slipped a disc or something. And one of the things the doctor will do is say, hey, we're going to take some urine. And you'll say, what? That's nothing to do with that. Well, back pain that you feel in your back could actually be due to a kidney stone or other type of kidney problem. Anyway, so if you have these uroliths or kidney stones, we can do a radiograph, and some of them will show up on radiographs and some will not. And then we can decide how to treat. So if somebody has a small urolith and we think they can pass it, we just basically tell them to drink lots of fluids, maybe give them some diuretics, and eventually they'll pass that out through the urethra, which is incredibly painful. Another option is to go in there surgically and remove them. And finally, a third option is to use something called lithotripsy, where they actually use sound waves to break up those kidney stones. Okay, our next kidney disorder is something called polycystic kidney disease. And your textbook has this really grisly, ghoulish picture of what polycystic kidneys look like. You can notice they're no longer in the patient because these were probably taken out as part of a kidney transplant or after this person died. So polycystic kidney disease results from having all these like fluid-filled cysts in the kidneys. And it's usually a genetic condition, and it manifests itself in a person having high blood pressure. They'll have abdominal or back pain. They'll have excessive urination. They'll have blood in the urine, which is called hematuria. They might have headaches, like I said, abdominal pain, all types of symptoms in there. And again, these polycystic kidneys are probably not functional once they get to this state. So the only way to treat this disease is, if we have a really bad polycystic kidney, is to remove it and do a kidney transplant. All right, now that we're done talking about kidney disorders, we're just going to spend the next few slides talking a little bit about the characteristics of urine. Now, we said before that the color of urine indicates its concentration. If we have a really dark urine, like over on the left-hand side, that indicates a patient who is probably dehydrated, and they have high amounts of ADH, and that ADH is helping them to produce a concentrated urine with a minimal amount of water loss. On the other hand, if we have a straw-covered urine, it means that we have somebody that's usually really well hydrated, and so their body's not bothering to hang on to the extra water. It's getting rid of extra water. So in addition to having a urine that looks like this, they would probably have a much larger volume of urine in compared to the one at left that has the small volume of dark-colored urine. Okay, other characteristics of urine. Now, most times urine is slightly acidic. It has a pH of around 6 on average, can be as low as 4.5. However, it can be alkaline as well. You can have a pH of urine going up to 8 or 9. We do this in our class where we give somebody an antacid like baking soda, and their pH of the urine will shift up because the urine is trying to get rid of that excess bicarbonate ions. The other times when you might have alkaline urine is, 1, during a urinary tract infection, or 2, if you are a strict vegan. So people that are vegan, that are not eating animal proteins, oftentimes have alkaline urine. Okay, so what is in urine? So a lot of what's in urine is just water, right? 95% water, that makes sense. And then everything else is solutes. Solutes are things that are dissolved in the solution, and the solution here is water. So number 1, we had urea. Urea was derived from protein metabolism. It's a waste product similar to ammonia. We have uric acid, and then something called creatinine, which comes from muscle metabolism. This is something we're trying to get rid of. We don't reabsorb it. And then we have all our electrolytes: sodium, potassium, phosphate, sulfate. So these are different electrolytes or ions that we're getting rid of if we have excess amounts in the bloodstream. All right, last but not least, I just want to answer this question because I get asked it every semester. Dr. Langston, should I drink my urine? No, you should not. Can you drink your urine? Absolutely. You can drink motor oil, but I wouldn't advise it. So urine here contains metabolic byproducts like urea, which we really don't want to re-ingest again. The other common misconception is that people think that urine is sterile. Well, when it's in the urinary bladder, oftentimes it is. However, when it leaves your urethra, oftentimes your urethra is contaminated with bacteria from the genital organs or from the anus or something like that. So by the time it reaches the outside, it's probably been seeded with some bacteria. And if you leave that urine there for very long, it's going to start to multiply those bacteria because there's lots of stuff in there that the bacteria like to eat. So big picture here is, unless you're on a desert island with nothing else to drink, don't drink urine. All right, you've reached the end of the lecture on the urinary system. As always, if you have any murky points you're not sure about, go back and review those points in the lecture. If you still have questions, give me a call or send me a text message. Talk to you soon.